The staff eyed him with barely disguised contempt, treating him like he didn't belong among the polished marble floors and sparkling displays. They had no idea who he really was. Within months, the old man they dismissed would become their new boss, buying out the entire high-end brand and changing its rules forever. Discover how one man turned rejection into revolution, reshaping the world of luxury forever. James walked slowly down the cracked sidewalk of his neighborhood, nodding politely to the familiar faces around him. He had lived here for most of his life, knew nearly everyone by name, and had watched children grow up and move on, only to return as adults. His years had softened him in ways but strengthened him in others. His face, lined with the wisdom of age, bore a quiet dignity, while his eyes, sharp and lively, revealed a keen mind that was always observant. Today he wore his favorite brown jacket and a wide-brimmed hat, carrying himself with the quiet pride he'd held since his youth. As he strolled, people greeted him warmly. He stopped to talk to Mrs. Green, an elderly lady who tended to her small flower garden outside her apartment building. She shared stories of her grandchildren, laughing as she recounted their antics. James listened intently, chuckling along, his laughter a deep, warm rumble. Further down the street, a group of young men nodded respectfully, calling him Mr. James. He offered a few words of advice and encouragement, always careful to listen more than he spoke, knowing that sometimes young people just needed someone to see them, to care. Finally, he arrived at his granddaughter Sarah's apartment. She was graduating soon, and James felt a strong desire to gift her something meaningful, something that reflected how proud he was of her achievements. Sarah was the first in the family to go to college, and her determination had reminded him so much of himself when he was younger. The thought of surprising her with a special gift filled him with excitement. He had already chosen the perfect item in his mind, a beautiful necklace he'd seen displayed in the window of a high-end store. He imagined the joy on her face as she opened the box, and the thought lifted his spirits even more. Later that day, he dressed in his finest clothes and headed toward the upscale part of town, where the store was located. He rarely ventured into these areas, but today, he didn't let the polished sidewalks and shiny storefronts deter him. When he reached Elise and Company, the high-end boutique known for its luxury items, he paused briefly, taking a deep breath. He felt a twinge of hesitation, but he brushed it aside, his mind fixed on Sarah's graduation and how much this gift would mean to her. The store was sleek, quiet, and pristine. The faint smell of expensive perfume lingered in the air as James walked through the door, his boots echoing on the marble floor. A few elegantly dressed employees stood behind glass counters, each one focused on their tasks. One of them, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a sleek dress, looked up as James entered. She raised an eyebrow, her lips pressing into a thin line. James approached her with a polite nod and explained that he was looking for a gift for his granddaughter, describing the necklace he'd seen. The woman's face showed a hint of surprise, her gaze sweeping over his worn jacket and hat. Her tone remained professional, but there was a slight edge, a stiffness that James didn't miss. She guided him over to a display case but didn't make eye contact as she spoke. When James asked to see the necklace up close, she hesitated, glancing around as if uncertain whether he was a serious customer. James kept his voice steady, hiding any reaction to her reluctance, but inside, a familiar feeling stirred, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. The feeling of being judged, not for who he was, but for what he looked like. The woman's doubt was clear, her gestures and looks revealing more than her words did. Finally, she sighed, lifting the necklace out of the case but holding it tightly, as though she feared he might damage it. James reached out carefully, admiring the delicate craftsmanship, picturing it resting around Sarah's neck, her face lighting up with joy. But before he could say much else, the woman interrupted him. "Sir, I'm not sure if you're aware, but this piece is quite exclusive," she said, her voice barely hiding her disdain. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at him, as if daring him to walk away. "It's one of our more premium selections. Perhaps something else might be more." Suitable? James's heart sank slightly, but he held his composure. He calmly asked the price, though he noticed she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned her attention to a well-dressed couple who had just entered, excusing herself with a smile that was warm and welcoming. A smile that hadn't been offered to him. James stood there momentarily forgotten, his hand still resting on the counter. When the woman returned, her tone had shifted even further. She looked at him as though he was wasting her time. Perhaps it would be best to consider something within a different range, she suggested with a thin smile, her eyes cold. The message was clear. She didn't believe he belonged there. James felt the weight of her judgment settle on him like a heavy coat. It was the kind of look he had seen too often, one that reminded him of past moments when people had doubted him solely because of his appearance. A silence stretched between them as he looked back at her, his face calm, but his heart filled with a sense of quiet outrage. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the store, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing in his mind. James walked back home, his mind heavy with the woman's condescending gaze and the dismissive tone that had accompanied her words. Memories of past slights flickered through his thoughts, small moments he had tried to bury over the years. He thought he had moved past them, that age had given him peace with the way things were. Yet something about this experience lingered, like a thorn just beneath the surface. Back in his cozy living room, James sat quietly, his thoughts still on Sarah. The image of her receiving the necklace remained vivid, but now it was tainted with the humiliation he'd felt. He told himself it didn't matter, that he'd find another way to make her feel special, another gift that didn't come from a place where he wasn't welcome. But as he sat there, he felt an unusual resolve building, something deeper than the sting of a single interaction. This wasn't just about a necklace. It was about something much larger, something that reached back over a lifetime of quiet endurance. He leaned back in his armchair, feeling the weight of his decision form, solid and steady. The next morning, he called his old friend and business partner Clarence, a sharp and insightful man who had been with James through both hard times and triumphs. They hadn't spoken about business in years, but Clarence knew the tone in James's voice meant something serious. They met at a quiet coffee shop, sitting in a corner booth where they could talk without interruption. Clarence looked at James, eyes narrowing as he sensed a shift in his old friend. "What's going on, James?" he asked, leaning forward with genuine concern. James told him everything, the way the woman in the store had looked at him, the dismissive way she had handled him, and the years of feeling as though certain places were designed to make people like him feel small. Clarence listened, nodding slowly, but his face showed that he understood every word, every unspoken thought. James took a deep breath before voicing the idea that had been swirling in his mind since he'd left the store. "I want to change this, Clarence," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "I'm tired of walking away. I want to buy Elise and Company, and I want to change how they treat people. I want people to walk in there and feel valued, no matter who they are or where they come from." Clarence's eyebrows shot up, his mouth parting in surprise, but he didn't speak immediately. Instead, he studied James carefully, as though weighing the seriousness of his words. After a moment, a slow smile spread across his face, admiration and understanding mixing with the surprise. "That's a big move, James," he replied thoughtfully. "But I know you, and I know once you've set your mind to something, there's no turning back. You really want to do this?" James nodded, his gaze steady. "This isn't just about me," he said. "I've been lucky. I made a good life, built my own way. But there are a lot of people out there who still feel like they don't belong. I want to create a place where they're welcomed, where they're respected. Elise and Company can be that place. I'm going to make sure of it." The two men began to talk logistics. Clarence, who still kept tabs on the business world, offered insights, connections, and suggestions. He reminded James of old contacts and helped him outline a plan for the next steps. James listened carefully, feeling both the weight and the thrill of his decision settling in his mind. This was no small endeavor, and he knew he'd face challenges, but his conviction grew with each word, each point they discussed. By the end of the conversation, they had laid out the first steps. Clarence promised to reach out to a few trusted contacts who could discreetly help initiate the process. James's determination was clear. He wasn't going to walk into that store again as a customer hoping for fair treatment. This time he intended to walk in as the man who would set the terms, the man who would change things for everyone who had ever felt the way he had. As James left the coffee shop, his heart was no longer burdened with anger or shame. Instead, he felt a sense of purpose, a fierce determination that carried him forward. This wasn't just about proving a point. It was about creating something lasting, something that would open doors instead of closing them. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly powerful, and he knew he wouldn't stop until his vision became a reality. Over the next few weeks, James moved carefully but steadily, keeping his plans close and sharing them only with a select few who could help him quietly gather information. He wanted to be certain before making any bold moves, and he understood the importance of subtlety in a world that could so quickly turn cold and resistant to change. Clarence had put him in touch with a lawyer, an old friend named Marcus, who specialized in acquisitions and had a reputation for discretion. One evening, James sat across from Marcus in his small, dimly lit office. Piles of documents and legal books cluttered the desk, but Marcus was calm and organized, with a precise, almost mathematical way of speaking. He reviewed James's intentions with a mix of skepticism and intrigue, listening carefully as James laid out his vision for Elise and company. When James finished, Marcus leaned back, tapping his pen against the desk thoughtfully. "It's ambitious, James," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of admiration. "And it won't be easy. You're talking about taking control of a brand with deep roots, an image carefully crafted over decades. They're not going to let someone like you, someone they consider an outsider, just waltz in and redefine everything." James smiled faintly. He'd expected this reaction, but he wasn't deterred. "I'm not looking to waltz in," he replied calmly. "I'm ready to push through whatever barriers they put up. I've spent my life learning to navigate around obstacles, Marcus. This time, I'm going through them." Marcus nodded, a hint of respect glinting in his eyes. "All right then. We'll need to be strategic about this. First, I'll start looking into Elise and Company's shareholder structure. Knowing who holds the power within the company will give us a clearer picture of how to approach the acquisition." They spent hours that night mapping out a detailed plan. Marcus explained that they would need to make their moves gradually, buying shares quietly through various channels to avoid drawing attention too soon. James nodded, listening intently to every detail. He didn't just want to buy the company. He wanted to understand it inside and out. He wanted to know its weak points, its strengths, and every hidden corner that had contributed to its exclusivity. He knew that only then could he begin to dismantle the very culture that had dismissed him. As the plan began to take shape, James felt an unexpected thrill. This was unlike anything he had ever done before, and he understood the risks involved. Yet, beneath the uncertainty, he felt a growing excitement. For the first time, he wasn't simply reacting to the world around him. He was shaping it. And the thought of transforming a place like Elise and Company into something better, something that would welcome people from all backgrounds, filled him with a sense of purpose. Over the following days, Clarence and Marcus worked tirelessly on James's behalf. They used their connections discreetly, tapping into networks James hadn't touched in years. Slowly, shares of Elise and Company began to shift ownership, piece by piece, all under the radar. James watched with quiet anticipation as his influence over the company began to grow, even though the brand itself remained unaware of the change looming on the horizon. Late one evening, Marcus called James with an update. "We've made progress," he said, his voice holding a note of satisfaction. "You're in a good position now, but there's still a ways to go. The biggest shareholders are still in play. They'll be the hardest to convince." James felt the familiar tug of doubt, a voice in his mind questioning whether he was biting off more than he could chew. But he silenced it quickly, reminding himself of the reason he'd started this journey. This wasn't about personal revenge or proving himself. It was about creating a future where people like him could walk into any store, any place, and be treated with the dignity they deserved. Weeks turned into months, and James's quiet takeover of Elise and Company continued to unfold with careful precision. Every step brought him closer to his goal, but each movement was marked by an increasing awareness of the challenges that lay ahead. He remained in close contact with Marcus and Clarence, each of them working tirelessly behind the scenes to keep his efforts concealed. James knew that if Elise & Co. caught wind of his intentions too early, they would likely retaliate, either by rallying loyal shareholders or by taking measures to protect their brand's exclusivity. He couldn't allow that, not when he was so close. One brisk autumn morning, James found himself sitting across from one of Elise & Company's top shareholders, a stern, silver-haired man named Robert Langston. Langston was a formidable figure in the world of luxury retail, known for his unyielding commitment to keeping high-end brands pure and untouched by what he deemed mainstream trends. James had managed to secure a meeting with him through a mutual connection, though Langston had only agreed out of curiosity, no doubt wondering who this quiet, determined man was, and why he showed such interest in Elise & Co. James presented his case with calm conviction, explaining his vision for a more inclusive, welcoming brand, a place where luxury could coexist with diversity and respect. Langston listened, his face expressionless, but James could sense the quiet disapproval in his silence. When James finished, Langston folded his hands and leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "You have to understand, Mr. Thompson," he began slowly. "Elise & Company has spent decades building an image. We cater to a specific clientele, people who expect a certain exclusivity. They don't want to walk into our stores and see just anyone shopping there. That's not what this brand is about. And, quite frankly, it's what keeps us successful." James's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his tone steady. "I respect the brand's history, Mr. Langston, but times are changing and so are people's expectations. Luxury doesn't have to mean exclusion. In fact, I believe that opening the doors wider will only strengthen the brand. Elise & Company can be a place that's respected not just for its products but for its values." Langston's mouth twisted into a slight smirk, as though he found the idea amusing. "With all due respect, Mr. Thompson, that sounds idealistic, if not naive. People come to Elise & Company to be part of something exclusive, something special. We're not looking to become a feel-good brand. We cater to those who have achieved enough to afford the best and prefer to keep it that way." The dismissiveness in Langston's words stirred something in James, the same feeling he'd experienced in that store months ago. But instead of backing down, he leaned in, meeting Langston's gaze with quiet intensity. "Mr. Langston, with respect, I'm not asking for permission. I'm offering you a chance to be part of something groundbreaking. You see, Elise & Company will change, whether you support it or not. And those who stand in the way of progress, well, they often find themselves left behind. I'm giving you an opportunity to be on the right side of history." Langston's smirk faded, his expression hardening. He seemed both irritated and intrigued by James's unwavering determination. There was a long pause as he measured James, assessing him in a new light. After a moment he spoke, his tone guarded. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" "More than you can imagine," James replied, his voice steady and unyielding. Langston sighed, tapping his fingers on the desk thoughtfully. "I'm not a fan of this idea, but I respect your conviction. If you manage to pull this off, I might reconsider my stance. But understand, this won't be easy. The board will push back, and so will our clientele. You're challenging a culture that's been ingrained for generations." James gave a slight nod, accepting the reality of the challenge. "I understand. I'm prepared to face it." Langston finally extended his hand, a reluctant yet respectful gesture. James shook it firmly, feeling the weight of an unspoken agreement. Langston hadn't fully committed to supporting him, but he had at least acknowledged James's determination, and that was enough for now. As James walked away from the meeting, he felt both the thrill of a small victory and the awareness of the greater battle ahead. He was chipping away at the walls Elise & Co. had built around itself, bit by bit, gaining ground with each conversation, each quietly acquired share. He knew he couldn't rest yet, not until the brand truly lay within his grasp. And as he looked back on Langston's guarded expression, he realized something important. The resistance he was facing wasn't just about business or luxury. It was about changing a mindset, one that had kept people like him on the outside for too long. That knowledge fueled him, and he returned to his plans with a renewed resolve, ready to push further, knowing that the most significant battles were yet to come. In the weeks that followed his meeting with Langston, James remained deeply embedded in the intricate process of acquiring Elise & Company, each step revealing new layers of the brand's complexity. Clarence and Marcus worked alongside him, providing insights and connections, while James himself navigated the silent resistance from those within the company who either didn't know of his intentions or were starting to suspect that change was in the air. One crisp evening, as he and Clarence reviewed financial reports in James's living room, Marcus called with news that could shift the momentum of their plan. "James," he began, a trace of excitement in his usually composed voice, "there's been a shift in the board. One of the primary shareholders is considering selling their shares, significantly more than we initially planned for." James leaned forward, eyes widening. This was unexpected. He had hoped to acquire shares gradually, quietly building his stake until he could approach the board with undeniable influence. But this opportunity could accelerate everything. If he could secure these shares, he'd have a significant foothold in Elise & Company, enough to push his way into a controlling position within the company. "Who is the seller?" James asked, his voice calm, but edged with anticipation. "A young investor named Vanessa Reed," Marcus replied. "She inherited her shares from her father, but she's made it clear she's more interested in tech ventures than fashion. I don't think she's even emotionally attached to Elise & Company. She's looking for a good deal and a quick exit." James nodded thoughtfully. "So, if we act fast, she'd be willing to sell?" "Yes," Marcus confirmed. "But the price will be steep. She knows the value of what she's holding, and she's not willing to let it go for less than top dollar. I wanted to check with you before moving forward." James took a deep breath, glancing at Clarence, who gave a small, encouraging nod. This was a gamble, but one that could bring him closer to his goal much faster than he'd anticipated. He had the resources, thanks to years of careful savings and a few wise investments, but the amount required would be substantial. If he failed, this acquisition would leave him vulnerable, with much of his fortune tied up in a company that might still resist his influence. Yet, the thought of delaying his vision felt unbearable. He remembered the dismissive glances, the judgment he had faced, and the people like him who would continue to be excluded if Elise & Company remained unchanged. This wasn't just a financial decision. It was a personal one. He looked at Marcus, his voice steady and resolute. "Go ahead," he said. "Let's make her an offer." Over the next few days, Marcus negotiated with Vanessa's representatives. Each conversation was tense, both sides pushing for the best deal, neither willing to concede easily. James found himself pacing his living room late at night, unable to rest as he waited for updates. The stakes were high, and his nerves felt stretched thin. He knew that this transaction would define the path forward, a make-or-break moment in his journey. Finally, after days of negotiations, Marcus called with the news James had been waiting for. "She accepted," he announced, his tone filled with satisfaction. "The shares are yours, James. You now own a significant stake in Elise & Company." A wave of relief washed over James, followed by a surge of excitement. This was more than just a financial gain. It was a foothold in a world that had once been closed off to him. Now, with Vanessa's shares in hand, he held enough power to secure a position on the board. This was the opening he needed, the opportunity to make his voice heard within the company's highest ranks. That evening, James sat quietly, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The years of struggle, the countless times he had been turned away, the indignities he had endured, all of it had led to this moment. And yet, he knew the real work was only just beginning. This stake was his ticket into the heart of Elise and Company. But it would take much more than ownership to shift the culture that had excluded him and so many others. As he prepared for his first board meeting, James felt a mix of anticipation and resolve. He knew the board members would see him as an outsider, someone whose presence challenged their traditional views. But he also knew that he was now equipped with the influence to make them listen. For the first time in his life, James wasn't knocking at the door, asking for entry. He was stepping through it, ready to reshape the world inside. The day of the board meeting arrived, and James found himself standing outside the sleek glass headquarters of Elise and Company. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle around him. This was no longer just a dream or an idea. He was here, inside the very building that represented everything he'd set out to change. With a sense of quiet resolve, he straightened his shoulders and walked through the doors, his footsteps echoing softly on the polished marble floors. The receptionist greeted him with a polite smile, though her expression shifted slightly when he introduced himself as a new board member. She quickly masked her surprise, directing him to the elevator with the same practiced professionalism she offered every guest. But James noticed the slight hesitation, a flicker of the same doubt he'd seen so many times before. It only strengthened his determination as he stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. As the elevator ascended, James reviewed his notes and thoughts, mentally preparing himself for what he expected to be a difficult meeting. He knew that his presence was likely to stir resistance. The board members were accustomed to a very specific kind of exclusivity, one he represented a direct challenge to. But he had come prepared, armed with both his conviction and his knowledge of the company's recent struggles. Elise and Company had been losing traction with younger customers, many of whom found the brand outdated and out of touch. This was his leverage, a reason they couldn't ignore him, however much they might want to. The elevator doors opened, and James stepped out into a bright modern hallway that led to a large glass-walled conference room. Inside, the board members were already seated, their expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism as they watched him enter. Robert Langston was there, seated near the head of the table, his face a neutral mask, though his eyes held a glint of intrigue. James returned his gaze with calm determination, giving a small nod before taking his seat. The chairman, an impeccably dressed man named Richard Collier, cleared his throat, directing the room's attention toward James. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Mr. James Thompson, our newest board member," he announced, his tone carefully polite, though it lacked any genuine warmth. James nodded to the group, meeting each person's gaze with quiet confidence. He could feel the tension in the room, a subtle resistance in the air. They weren't accustomed to newcomers, especially ones who didn't fit their usual mold. But James wasn't here to blend in. He was here to make them listen. Collier continued, his expression shifting as he prepared to address the agenda. "Mr. Thompson, we understand you've taken a significant interest in the direction of Elise and Company. We appreciate your enthusiasm. However, I'd like to remind you that the brand's image and reputation have been carefully cultivated over many years. We've built this company on principles that have stood the test of time, and change is not something we approach lightly." James leaned forward, his voice calm but unyielding. "Mr. Collier, I appreciate the value of tradition, but I also believe that clinging to the past can hold a brand back, especially in a world that's constantly evolving. Elise and Company has built a legacy, yes, but that legacy should include growth, embracing people from all backgrounds, not just a select few. Exclusivity doesn't have to mean exclusion." A ripple of murmurs passed around the table, a few board members exchanging looks, their expressions betraying a mix of surprise and discomfort. Collier's mouth tightened slightly, but he maintained his composed demeanor. "Mr. Thompson," he said smoothly, "Elise and Company has always prided itself on its unique clientele. Our customers expect a certain standard, one that doesn't align with the kind of open access you seem to be proposing." James took a deep breath, prepared for this resistance. "With respect, Mr. Collier, your so-called unique clientele is a shrinking demographic. Younger customers are seeking brands that align with their values, brands that are inclusive, authentic, and forward-thinking. If Elise & Company wants to remain relevant, we need to evolve." He continued, leaning into his argument, "I'm not suggesting we lose what makes Elise & Company special. I'm suggesting we expand that appeal. Open the door to new customers who are looking for more than just a label. They want to feel valued. I'm here to help Elise & Company achieve that without compromising its quality." The room fell silent as James's words settled over the group. Langston watched him with a mix of caution and grudging respect, while Collier's carefully controlled expression hinted at reluctance. After a tense pause, Collier finally spoke, his tone more measured. "Mr. Thompson, I understand your perspective, but change is a complex matter, especially when it risks alienating our loyal customers. Elise & Co. has a certain prestige, a brand identity that has kept us successful for decades." James looked around the table, meeting each board member's gaze with quiet intensity. "That prestige can still thrive, but only if it's redefined for the world we live in today. If we refuse to change, we'll eventually be left behind. I'm not asking you to abandon Elise & Company's roots. I'm asking you to let it grow." Another silence stretched across the room. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable but also intrigued. They hadn't expected this level of directness, this unwavering confidence from the new member. It was clear that James wasn't going to back down, and they could no longer ignore the possibility that he might have a point. Finally, Langston leaned forward, breaking the silence. "I propose that we consider Mr. Thompson's perspective," he said, surprising a few of his colleagues. "Perhaps there's room to explore new avenues without abandoning what we've built." James felt a flicker of triumph at Langston's support, knowing it was a small but significant victory. Collier hesitated, clearly weighing the situation before giving a reluctant nod. "Very well," he said. "We'll review our options and reconvene at the next meeting to discuss potential strategies." The meeting adjourned shortly after, the board members dispersing with a mixture of reluctance and curiosity. As James walked out of the room, he felt a surge of satisfaction. He had planted a seed, a small but vital shift in their thinking. It was only the beginning, but he knew that change, however slow, had started. Stepping back into the elevator, James allowed himself a rare smile. He hadn't just gained a seat at the table, he had opened a door, and he intended to walk through it, bringing others with him, no matter how many walls he had to break down along the way. In the days following the board meeting, James sensed the subtle shift in the air around him. The whispers had begun, quiet, hesitant conversations among the board members and executives, who were both curious and wary of the changes he hinted at. James understood that real change would not happen overnight, especially in a company so deeply rooted in tradition, but he felt a quiet satisfaction knowing he'd planted the idea in their minds. Now, he needed to act on that momentum. One afternoon, he scheduled a meeting with the company's marketing director, a poised woman named Evelyn, who had been with Elise & Company for over a decade. She was known for her meticulous attention to the brand's image and her ability to keep its marketing in line with the tastes of their exclusive clientele. James suspected that she, more than anyone else, would have strong opinions about his plans, but he also knew she was influential and could be a valuable ally if he managed to gain her support. When Evelyn walked into his office, she wore a perfectly tailored suit and an expression of polite curiosity. James invited her to sit, and they exchanged brief pleasantries before he launched into his vision for the brand's future. He spoke of inclusivity, of shifting the company's tone to welcome a broader range of customers, of expanding the brand's appeal without compromising its prestige. He described campaigns that celebrated diversity, ads that told stories of different people finding themselves in Elise & Co.'s clothing, and partnerships with communities that were often overlooked by high-end brands. As he spoke, Evelyn listened intently, her expression unreadable, though he noticed the occasional tightening of her jaw. When he finished, she paused, gathering her thoughts before speaking in a carefully measured tone. "Mr. Thompson, I appreciate your vision. I truly do," she began, choosing her words cautiously. "But Elise & Co. has always been about elegance, refinement, exclusivity. Our clientele takes pride in being part of something rare, something distinguished. Inclusivity is a noble idea, but it may dilute the brand. We don't want to alienate the people who have been loyal to us for so long." James leaned forward, meeting her gaze directly. "I understand your concerns, Evelyn, and I respect the work you've done to build Elise & Company's image. But the world is changing, and people's expectations are changing with it. If we refuse to adapt, we risk becoming irrelevant to an entire generation. Exclusivity doesn't have to mean keeping people out. It can mean creating something exceptional, something that people aspire to, while also making them feel valued." Evelyn's expression softened slightly as she considered his words. "And how do you propose we make this shift without losing our identity?" "I'm glad you asked," James replied, a hint of a smile crossing his face. He pulled out a folder containing a series of mock-up ad campaigns he'd developed with the help of a small independent agency he trusted. He spread the images across the desk, each one featuring models of diverse backgrounds wearing Elise & Company pieces in settings that ranged from urban streets to elegant interiors, blending the modern with the timeless. The ads were sophisticated, capturing the brand's classic elegance while showcasing a fresh, inclusive edge. One image showed a young woman with natural curls standing confidently in one of the brand's signature trench coats. Another featured an older man with silver hair and dark skin seated in a minimalist room, exuding the quiet power and grace that Elise & Company aimed to represent. Evelyn studied the images carefully, her fingers tracing the edges of the pages as she analyzed each one. Her expression softened, shifting from skepticism to intrigue. These are striking," she admitted quietly, almost to herself. "They're different, yes, but they still have that sense of elegance we're known for." "That's the idea," James said, his tone warm but firm. "We're not changing who we are, we're expanding what we represent. We're telling people that Elise & Coers can be part of their lives too, regardless of who they are or where they come from. It's about creating a sense of belonging, even within a luxury brand." Evelyn nodded slowly, her initial resistance visibly weakening. She seemed to see the potential, the possibility that Elise & Company could evolve without losing its identity. "This could work," she murmured, almost to herself, before looking up at James with a more focused gaze. "But you understand, this won't be easy. We'll have to be careful about how we introduce this shift to our current customers. They're accustomed to a certain image." "I understand," James replied, his voice steady. "I'm not looking to force anything overnight. We'll take it step by step, starting with smaller campaigns, testing the waters, showing them that Elise & Company can evolve gracefully. And we'll listen to their feedback, adapting as we go. But the key is to start." After a long pause, Evelyn finally nodded, her posture relaxing slightly as she offered a small, genuine smile. "All right, Mr. Thompson, I'll work with you on this. Let's see if we can find a way to balance tradition with innovation. If we can do that, I think we might just be able to create something remarkable." James felt a sense of victory, quiet but profound. He knew that winning Evelyn over was a crucial step, and her support would lend credibility to his vision among the rest of the company. With her on his side, he could begin implementing changes without the immediate resistance he'd anticipated. As Evelyn left his office, James felt the first real flickers of progress taking root. His journey was far from over, but he'd begun to build a foundation, one that could support the kind of company he wanted Elise & Company to become. For the first time since he'd stepped into the brand's world, he felt a sense of genuine possibility. a belief that Elise and Company could be transformed, not just in name, but in spirit. And he knew, as he watched Evelyn disappear down the hallway, that he had just taken one more step toward fulfilling that vision. In the weeks that followed his breakthrough with Evelyn, James began rolling out the initial phase of his new vision. Together, they crafted a modest but eye-catching social media campaign designed to test the waters without fully committing the brand to an immediate transformation. The campaign, called EU Elegance for All, featured select pieces from Elise & Company's latest collection, modeled by individuals from various backgrounds. Each image was carefully curated to maintain the brand's signature elegance, while subtly introducing a more inclusive tone. The first posts went live one crisp morning, accompanied by a short message from the brand about redefining luxury as something personal, meaningful, and universal. Within hours, the campaign began to draw attention. Comments flooded in, some positive, some skeptical. Longtime customers expressed their surprise, noting the unfamiliar direction the brand seemed to be taking. But a younger audience, one that Elise & Company had struggled to reach before, responded with enthusiasm. They shared the posts widely, praising the brand's decision to broaden its image, calling it refreshing and overdue. James watched the reactions closely, feeling a cautious optimism as the campaign began to take root. The brand's Instagram and Twitter engagement surged, driven by discussions that, for the first time, included people who had never considered Elise & Company relevant to their lives. There was pushback, as he had expected. Some voices in the comments questioned the brand's choice to deviate from its traditional aesthetic, expressing doubts about whether Elise & Co. could maintain its prestige. Despite the mixed responses, James remained focused on the bigger picture. He and Evelyn worked late into the evenings, analyzing feedback, identifying what resonated and what didn't. They adjusted future posts based on this feedback, fine-tuning the message to bridge the gap between Elise & Co.'s loyal clientele and the new audience they sought to attract. Evelyn's skepticism had softened into cautious enthusiasm, and James could see that she was beginning to believe in his vision, even if she still approached it with a degree of professional restraint. One afternoon, as James and Evelyn reviewed the latest analytics, the door to his office opened, and Richard Collier stepped inside. Collier, who had remained largely silent on James's initiatives, had been observing the campaign from a distance. James could tell from Collier's expression that he wasn't here to offer praise, but rather to discuss his growing concerns. "James, Evelyn," Collier began, his tone formal and cool. "I wanted to speak to you both about the recent changes we've seen on our social media. I appreciate the innovation, but I'm concerned that we may be alienating our established clientele. Our brand has always represented a certain exclusivity, and I fear we're drifting from that core principle." James nodded, acknowledging Collier's concerns while mentally preparing his response. "I understand your point, Richard," he replied calmly. "But I believe we're not abandoning exclusivity. We're redefining it. Elise & Company can still stand for elegance and quality while reaching a broader audience. Luxury is evolving. It's becoming more about meaning and experience than just status. If we stay rooted in the old ways, we risk becoming irrelevant." Collier's gaze hardened, a flicker of skepticism flashing in his eyes. "Luxury brands thrive on identity, James. A clear, unmistakable identity. If we try to be everything to everyone, we risk diluting what made Elise & Company special in the first place." James met his gaze, unflinching. "With respect, Richard, we're not trying to be everything to everyone. We're expanding what special means. Elise & Company can retain its identity while embracing modern values. Imagine a brand that people see as aspirational, but also one that respects and values its customers, whoever they are. That's real prestige, the kind that builds loyalty for generations." A tense silence filled the room as Collier weighed James's words. Evelyn, sensing the weight of the moment, added, "Richard, we've been watching the campaign closely. The initial response shows promise. We're seeing engagement from people who had previously dismissed Elise & Company, as out of reach or out of touch. This doesn't mean we're abandoning our legacy. It means we're adapting it. Collier's eyes shifted between them, his expression a mixture of reluctance and consideration. He seemed to realize that, despite his reservations, James's approach was backed by careful planning and genuine belief. Finally, he sighed, his tone softening slightly. "All right, James, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt for now. But understand, I'll be monitoring this closely. The brand's identity isn't something we can afford to gamble with." James nodded, a sense of relief mingling with the underlying tension. He understood Collier's concerns. This was, after all, a major shift for Elise and company. But he also knew that real change required risk, and he was prepared to take that on. As Collier left the office, James and Evelyn exchanged a glance, both sensing the gravity of what they were undertaking. Over the next few weeks, they expanded the campaign, slowly introducing new elements that built on the theme of inclusivity. They launched short videos telling the stories of the models, each one a unique individual with their own background and journey. These stories resonated deeply, further bridging the gap between tradition and progress and showcasing that elegance was not bound by a single definition. The campaign's impact began to ripple outward. Fashion bloggers, influencers, and even a few media outlets picked up on the shift at Elise & Company, sparking discussions about what it meant for luxury brands to adapt to modern values. James saw that his vision was starting to take root beyond the company, stirring conversations and curiosity about how an established brand could redefine its place in the world. As James watched this transformation unfold, he felt a profound sense of purpose. The journey was far from over, but he was finally beginning to see the company he had envisioned, a company that valued everyone who walked through its doors, a brand that was inclusive not just in word, but in spirit. The momentum continued to build, and with each passing day, James felt a sense of pride watching Elise & Company grow into a brand that could resonate with a wider, more diverse audience. But as the campaign gained traction, the internal resistance also became more pronounced. Board members who had remained silent or skeptical at the start were now openly questioning his direction. Their discomfort with the brand's shift became evident in meetings, where they expressed concerns about preserving tradition and maintaining standards. At the next board meeting, James could feel the tension in the room. The campaign's success had caught their attention, but so had the inevitable backlash from a few vocal long-time customers who resisted the brand's evolution. Richard Collier spoke first, his tone laced with both concern and a touch of frustration. "James," he began, his gaze steady, "it's no secret that you've generated a lot of interest in Elise & Co. with this new campaign. The engagement numbers are impressive, but we can't ignore the feedback from our core clientele. Many of them are concerned, even unsettled, by what they perceive as a departure from our brand's identity." James nodded, prepared for this moment. He had known it would come, that eventually they would want assurances that Elise & Company wasn't veering off course. He understood that many of them feared losing the exclusivity that had defined the brand for decades. But he also knew that change wasn't about eliminating the past. It was about building on it, redefining it. "I appreciate everyone's feedback," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I understand the importance of tradition, but Elise & Co. is evolving to be more than a symbol of status. It's becoming a brand that people feel a connection to. Our new audience isn't seeking to diminish what makes us unique. They're drawn to the elegance we represent, and they want to feel that they belong in that world too." A few board members shifted in their seats, their skepticism apparent. Langston, who had been watching James with a thoughtful expression, finally spoke up. "I'll admit, James, I was hesitant at first, but even I can't deny the numbers. We've reached an audience that wouldn't have looked twice at us before. And if we're honest, some of our traditional clientele were already beginning to drift toward other brands that embraced this new mindset. We can't survive on nostalgia alone." This unexpected support from Langston caught some of the board members off guard, and James could feel a subtle shift in the room. The dissenting voices grew quieter, the murmurs fading as they considered Langston's words. James seized the opportunity, feeling a renewed confidence as he pressed on. "I want Elise & Co. to be a brand that people aspire to, yes, but also a brand they feel seen by," he continued, his voice steady. "We're not losing our identity. We're expanding it. We're showing that true elegance doesn't exclude, it elevates. And this approach isn't just about social values, it's about business. Younger generations are driving the future of luxury. We need to meet them where they are, or we'll be left behind." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the board members. Collier exchanged a glance with Langston before giving a reluctant nod. "All right, James," he said slowly. "We'll continue down this path, cautiously, but I want regular updates on our customer retention. If we see a decline among our traditional clients, we'll need to reassess." James agreed, understanding that he was walking a delicate line. This was his chance to prove that inclusivity and prestige could coexist. But he knew that one misstep could lead to pushback that might jeopardize everything he'd worked for. The campaign's success continued, and over time, the shift in Elise & Company's identity started to become more visible. James noticed a gradual but significant change in the kind of customers walking into the flagship stores. They were younger, more diverse, and many were first-time buyers, drawn in by the brand's newly inclusive message. Some came from backgrounds that traditionally didn't engage with high-end fashion, but now they felt welcomed by a brand that seemed to speak to them, that seemed to see them. One day, James decided to visit one of the stores himself to witness the impact firsthand. He stepped into the bright, airy space, noting the subtle but intentional changes Evelyn had implemented to reflect the campaign's values. The store retained its elegance, but there were new touches. Photos from the Elegance for All campaign displayed on the walls, images of people of various backgrounds and ages, each wearing Elise & Co. pieces with confidence and style. The atmosphere felt both familiar and transformed, a space where tradition met progress. As he walked through the store, he overheard two young women admiring a trench coat on display, discussing how they'd always felt Elise & Company was out of reach until now. "It's nice to feel like this brand actually wants us here," one of them said, her tone surprised and pleased. The comment filled James with a quiet pride, knowing that his vision was becoming a reality in the most tangible way possible. Just as he was about to leave, he noticed a well-dressed older couple standing nearby, looking somewhat bewildered as they took in the changes. He approached them, introducing himself politely and asking if they needed any assistance. The man studied him, his expression guarded but polite. "You must be new here," he said. "This store, it's different from how it used to be. We've been loyal customers of Elise & Company for years, but this new direction, I'm not sure what to make of it." James smiled, understanding their hesitance. "I know it feels different," he replied gently, "but change doesn't mean we're losing what made us special. We're still Elise & Company, still committed to quality and elegance. We're simply making room for more people to experience what you've loved about this brand for so long." The woman looked thoughtful, glancing around the store. "I suppose it's interesting," she murmured, as though trying to convince herself. "It just takes some getting used to." James nodded, offering her a reassuring smile. "We value our loyal customers, and we want you to feel just as welcome as always. This evolution is meant to make Elise & Company stronger, so it can be enjoyed by future generations just as you have enjoyed it." The couple exchanged a look, seeming to soften slightly. They thanked him and continued browsing, their steps a little less hesitant. James watched them with a sense of satisfaction, understanding that acceptance would take time, that some customers would need reassurance to feel that their place within the brand was secure. As he left the store, he felt a renewed sense of determination. The journey he had started was not without its challenges, but every small moment, every conversation, every customer who felt more welcome than before, it all confirmed that he was on the right path. Elise & Co. was becoming more than just a symbol of luxury. It was becoming a brand with a soul, a place where elegance and inclusion walked hand in hand. And for the first time, James felt that the legacy he was building was something that would last beyond him, transforming not just the brand, but the industry itself. Despite the progress, James knew that the hardest challenges were yet to come. News of Elise & Co.'s evolving image began to spread more widely, and not everyone was pleased. A group of traditionalists, including some influential figures in the fashion industry, started voicing their discontent. They criticized the brand's new direction, arguing that it diluted the exclusivity that had set Elise & Company apart for generations. One morning, James received a formal letter requesting his presence at an emergency board meeting. The tone of the letter was stern, hinting at the gravity of the situation. As he entered the boardroom, he could feel the tension. The atmosphere was thick with unease, and the faces around the table were serious. Richard Collier stood at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. "James," Richard began, his voice measured, "we've received significant feedback from some of our most long-standing clients and partners. They are concerned about the recent changes and how they affect the brand's identity. Some have even threatened to withdraw their support and investments." James listened attentively, his face calm but alert. "I understand their concerns," he replied evenly. "Change can be unsettling, especially when it challenges long-held beliefs. But we've also gained a new and growing customer base that sees value in our inclusivity. The numbers show that we're not losing ground. We're expanding." Another board member, a stern woman named Margaret, leaned forward. "But at what cost?" she demanded. "Our reputation is built on tradition and exclusivity. If we lose that, we lose everything that makes Elise & Company prestigious." James met her gaze steadily. "Prestige doesn't have to exclude diversity," he said firmly. "In fact, embracing a broader clientele can enhance our reputation, showing that we are leaders, not followers, in the industry. We can set a new standard for what luxury means." The room murmured with dissent. Richard raised his hand to quiet them. "James, we appreciate your passion, but perhaps we need to find a compromise. Maybe we can scale back the campaign, return to our traditional marketing, and slowly integrate some of your ideas over time." James felt a surge of frustration but kept his composure. "With all due respect, we've already seen positive results from our current approach. Scaling back now would send a message that we're unsure of our direction. It could undermine the progress we've made and confuse our customers." Richard sighed, glancing around the table. "We need to consider the stability of the company. If key investors pull out, we could face serious financial issues. Perhaps it's time to rethink our strategy." James realized that he was at a pivotal moment. The board was wavering, and the future of his vision hung in the balance. He took a deep breath and stood up, addressing everyone in the room. "I started this journey because I believed that Elise & Co. could be more than it was. A brand that honors its heritage while embracing the future. Change is never easy, but it's necessary. If we retreat now, we'll be admitting that we're afraid to lead, afraid to grow. I understand the risks, but I also see the potential for greatness. I'm willing to invest more of my own resources to support this transition. I'm committed to seeing this through." The board members exchanged glances, surprised by his offer. Margaret looked skeptical, but others seemed to consider his words thoughtfully. Richard folded his hands, his expression contemplative. "Your dedication is admirable, James," he said slowly. "If you're willing to take on additional risk, perhaps we can give this direction more time. But we need to see tangible results, continued growth, increased sales, and a stable relationship with our investors." James nodded. "Agreed. I'll provide regular reports on our progress, and we can reassess as we move forward." The tension in the room eased slightly. The meeting concluded with a tentative agreement to continue on the current path, albeit with closer scrutiny. As the board members filed out, Langston approached James, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "You're fighting the good fight," Langston said quietly. "Don't lose heart. Change takes time, but it's worth it." James smiled gratefully. "Thank you for your support. It means a lot." In the following months, James worked tirelessly to ensure that Elise & Company's transformation not only continued, but accelerated. He reached out to new investors who shared his vision, securing additional funding to offset any losses from those who had withdrawn their support. He also focused on strengthening relationships with suppliers and partners who believed in the brand's new direction. The company's efforts began to pay off. Sales steadily increased, particularly among younger demographics. Media outlets featured Elise & Company as a pioneer in redefining luxury fashion, highlighting its commitment to inclusivity and social responsibility. Customer testimonials poured in, praising the brand for making high-quality fashion accessible and meaningful. One day, James received a letter from a young woman named Maya. She wrote about how she had always admired Elise & Company from afar, but never felt it was a place for someone like her. When she saw the new campaigns, she felt welcomed and valued. She saved up to buy her first Elise & Company dress, which she wore to a job interview. She got the job and credited the confidence she felt wearing that dress as a contributing factor. Reading her words, James felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Stories like Maya's were becoming more common, each one a testament to the impact of his efforts. The brand was not just selling products, it was empowering people, making a difference in their lives. At the next board meeting, the atmosphere was markedly different. The tension had lessened, replaced by a cautious optimism. Richard opened the meeting with a nod to James. "It appears that your strategy is yielding results," he acknowledged. "Our sales are up, and we've received positive media attention. The investors who were hesitant are starting to come around." Margaret, though still reserved, conceded with a slight smile. "I admit I was skeptical, but the numbers don't lie. Perhaps there is merit in this new direction." James thanked them, but he remained humble. "This is a team effort," he said. "We've all played a part in bringing Elise & Company into a new era. I believe we can continue to grow while honoring the legacy that made us who we are." As the meeting progressed, the discussions were more collaborative, focusing on how to build on their success. Plans were made to expand the product line, introduce new services, and explore sustainable practices that aligned with their renewed values. After the meeting, James stood by the large windows overlooking the city. The skyline was dotted with buildings old and new, a blend of history and progress. Langston joined him, following his gaze. "You've done something remarkable here," Langston said. "You've managed to change not just a company, but the way people think about what it means to be exclusive." James smiled softly. "It's not about excluding others to feel special," he replied. "It's about creating something exceptional that everyone can aspire to be a part of." Langston nodded thoughtfully. "I think you've given Elise & Company a legacy that will endure." James looked out at the city, feeling a deep sense of peace. "I hope so. For all the people like Maya and for future generations. That's all I ever wanted." Months passed, and Elise & Coers continued to thrive under James's leadership, embracing a reputation as a pioneering, inclusive luxury brand. Word of its transformation spread, bringing in waves of new clients and securing its position as a leader in redefining modern luxury. However, as the company's identity became more inclusive and progressive, new challenges arose from competitors who saw Elise & Co.'s success as a threat to their traditional hold on the luxury market. One evening, James received an invitation to a high-profile industry gala, an event he knew would be attended by the biggest names in luxury fashion, including CEOs and designers who upheld the traditional image of exclusivity and opulence. Despite knowing the atmosphere could be cold and unwelcoming, he accepted the invitation, understanding the importance of representing Elise & Company's vision on such a stage. As he arrived at the grand venue, a historic ballroom adorned with chandeliers and gold accents, he could feel the eyes on him. He was well aware that some in the industry viewed him as a disruptor, a man who had altered the rules of luxury fashion. As he made his way through the crowd, a few industry figures greeted him with polite nods while others turned away, their faces betraying disapproval. During the evening, James found himself in a conversation with Charles Beaumont, the CEO of a prestigious luxury brand known for its unyielding exclusivity. Beaumont had built his company on the ideals that Elise & Company was challenging, and he wasted no time in addressing his thoughts. "James," Beaumont said smoothly, holding a glass of champagne, "I must admit I don't quite understand this experiment you're running with Elise & Company. Luxury has always been about distinction, about catering to the few who can truly appreciate the best. Inclusivity is admirable, of course, but does it really belong in our world?" James maintained his calm, offering a slight smile. "Charles, I respect the work you've done in building your brand. But I believe that true luxury isn't just about who can afford it. It's about how it makes people feel. At Elise & Co., we're not just selling products. We're selling confidence, self-worth, and a sense of belonging. Our clients don't come to us merely for exclusivity. They come because they feel valued." Beaumont chuckled, though there was a hint of disdain in his laughter. "Value is one thing, James, but exclusivity is what sets luxury apart. When you let just anyone in, where's the allure?" James's expression remained steady, but his eyes held a quiet strength. "The allure, Charles, is in creating a brand that feels special to everyone who experiences it. When people feel seen and respected, they're drawn to it naturally. They choose us not just because of what we offer, but because of what we represent. That's a legacy that goes beyond profit margins and status symbols." Beaumont fell silent, clearly unused to having his perspective challenged so directly. Sensing the shift, James continued, speaking not just to Beaumont, but to the others within earshot. "Elise & Co. is showing that luxury can grow and evolve. It's about adapting to a world where people are searching for more than labels. They want meaning. And if that means changing the industry's definition of exclusivity, then I believe it's a change worth making." A small crowd had gathered around them, a mix of curiosity and respect visible on their faces. Some looked intrigued, others skeptical, but James could sense that his words were resonating, planting seeds of thought in a world that often resisted change. Eventually, the conversation shifted, and James moved through the crowd, meeting others who were cautiously curious about his approach, perhaps wondering if his vision might hold a truth they hadn't considered. That night, as he left the gala, James felt a quiet triumph. He had stood his ground, representing Elise & Company with conviction and purpose. For the first time, he sensed that even the traditionalists were beginning to see that his approach wasn't just a passing trend. It was the future. The next morning, James sat in his office, reflecting on the night before. He felt energized, as though his conversation with Beaumont had solidified his resolve. However, just as he was reviewing plans for Elise & Company's next campaign, he received a call from Marcus, his lawyer and friend. "James, there's something you need to be aware of," Marcus began, his tone serious. "It seems some of Elise & Company's competitors are pushing back more aggressively than we expected. They're lobbying against us, trying to sway the industry narrative and paint us as a brand that's lost its prestige by becoming too accessible." James listened carefully, absorbing the information. He'd anticipated resistance, but this was more direct, more targeted. Competitors were actively working to undermine Elise & Company's reputation, hoping to sway clients and industry influencers back to traditional ideals of luxury. Marcus continued, "They're spreading messages through influential publications and social circles, suggesting that Elise & Company has compromised its standards. They're framing us as a brand that's no longer elite, hoping to create doubts among our current and potential clients." James felt a surge of frustration, but quickly reined it in, his mind already working through possible responses. "Let them talk," he said calmly. "If anything, this only proves that they feel threatened. They see the impact we're making, and it scares them." Marcus chuckled, impressed by James's resolve. "I thought you'd say that, but you should know this might affect our relationships with certain luxury publications. Some of them are hesitant to cover our campaigns, worried they'll alienate their more traditional readership." James nodded, understanding the implications. "Then we'll go directly to our audience. We'll use our platforms, social media, influencers who believe in our vision. and independent publications that aren't bound by these outdated ideals. If the old guard won't tell our story, we'll tell it ourselves. Inspired, James gathered his team, sharing Marcus's news and outlining a new strategy. They would double down on their message, focusing on authentic storytelling and using platforms that resonated with their core audience. They brainstormed ideas for behind-the-scenes videos, customer testimonials, and influencer partnerships that could amplify their values. Evelyn suggested a series of mini-documentaries that highlighted real customers' experiences with Elise and Company, each story capturing the brand's impact on people's lives in a personal, meaningful way. The team worked tirelessly, producing content that celebrated the diversity, resilience, and elegance of their clientele. They shared stories that brought the brand's mission to life, stories that no competitor's rumor or smear campaign could diminish. They reached out to influencers who weren't just popular, but aligned with Elise and Company's values, creating partnerships that felt genuine and impactful. In the weeks that followed, the campaign took off, resonating with audiences in a way that surpassed their expectations. Elise and Company began trending on social media, with customers sharing their own stories of why the brand mattered to them. The narrative shifted, as people saw for themselves that the brand wasn't sacrificing prestige, it was redefining it. James watched the response unfold with quiet pride. He knew that he was no longer simply reacting to resistance. He was leading a movement. Elise & Co. had become more than just a brand. It was a symbol of change, a testament to the power of embracing progress while honoring tradition. One morning, as he reviewed the latest campaign results, Marcus called again, this time with a note of satisfaction in his voice. "James, I think you should know. Some of those same publications that hesitated to cover us before, they're reaching out now, wanting to feature Elise and Company and the impact you're making. Seems they're realizing this isn't just a trend after all." James smiled, feeling the weight of his efforts paying off. "Good," he replied, his voice steady. "Let's show them what true luxury looks like in the world we're building." And with that, he knew that Elise and Company was no longer merely evolving. It was setting the standard, transforming the industry one story, one campaign, one person at a time. With Elise & Co. now firmly recognized as a leader in inclusive luxury, James felt the weight of his accomplishments but also the pressure to keep moving forward. The public's response had been overwhelmingly positive, and the brand had garnered a newfound respect within the industry. However, as Elise & Co.'s success continued to grow, James knew he couldn't slow down. He wanted to cement this progress, to ensure the company's transformation was not just a passing phase, but a legacy. One day he called a meeting with his team, inviting both board members and department heads to discuss an ambitious idea that had been forming in his mind. When everyone was seated, James stood at the head of the table, his face thoughtful yet resolute. "I want us to create something that goes beyond just campaigns and products," he began, his voice carrying a quiet intensity. "Elise & Co. has the potential to do more, to be more. We've proven that luxury and inclusivity can go hand in hand. But now I want to establish a program that makes this philosophy a part of our core values." He paused, letting his words settle over the room before continuing. "I propose we launch the Elise & Company, Foundation for Opportunity and Elegance. This foundation would focus on supporting talented individuals from underrepresented communities in the world of fashion, designers, artisans, models, and even entrepreneurs. We would offer scholarships, mentorships, and funding for creative projects that align with our values." The room was silent as everyone absorbed the magnitude of his idea. Evelyn's eyes lit up with excitement, and even the more traditional board members looked intrigued, sensing the potential impact of such a program. "This foundation," James continued, "would not only strengthen our brand's commitment to inclusivity, but would also allow us to actively support and shape the future of luxury fashion. We're creating a legacy, one that inspires people to believe that elegance and opportunity are for everyone. Imagine the impact we could make by helping young designers and creators who might otherwise never get a chance to share their talents." Langston, who had become one of James's strongest supporters, nodded approvingly. "It's bold, James, and it's exactly what this brand stands for now. I think it would send a powerful message, both to the industry and to our customers, that we're not just here to talk about change, we're here to make it." Richard Collier, while initially reserved, raised a thoughtful hand. "How do we ensure this aligns with our financial goals? Establishing a foundation is noble, but it requires careful planning to ensure we're also meeting the needs of our shareholders." James had anticipated this question. The foundation will be structured to operate independently, funded partially by a portion of our profits and partially through partnerships with like-minded sponsors. This way, it doesn't impact our bottom line directly, but it strengthens our brand value and customer loyalty. People want to invest in companies that stand for something. This foundation will reinforce Elise & Company as a brand with purpose. With the support of the board, the Elise & Company Foundation for Opportunity and Elegance was officially approved. The company moved quickly, establishing partnerships with fashion schools, design programs, and artisans cooperatives. They reached out to industry leaders who had themselves overcome barriers, inviting them to mentor emerging talents supported by the foundation. Within months, the foundation began its work, awarding its first round of scholarships and supporting several budding designers who lacked access to resources. The industry took note, and Elise & Company gained further recognition for not only its transformation, but for actively contributing to the growth of a more inclusive and innovative future for luxury fashion. Elise & Co. was not only changing how the world saw luxury, but also how the next generation would shape it. One afternoon, James was invited to speak at a prestigious fashion conference. The invitation came with a special request. They wanted him to give the keynote speech, titled, "The Future of Luxury Beyond Exclusivity." He knew it was a powerful opportunity to solidify his ideas and inspire the industry even further. Standing on the stage in front of an audience that included industry leaders, journalists, designers, and young hopefuls, James took a deep breath. He scanned the room, feeling the energy and curiosity directed at him, and began his speech. When we think about luxury, most people still associate it with exclusivity, something that's meant for only a privileged few. He started, his voice calm but resonant. But what if luxury could mean something more? What if luxury could be a space where everyone feels valued, where elegance is accessible without compromising quality? That's the future I envision, a future where luxury is not a gate, but a door. He paused, letting his words sink in. At Elise & Co., we've taken that vision and made it real. We've challenged old assumptions, defied industry expectations, and we've seen that inclusivity and prestige can coexist. But this transformation wasn't about chasing trends. It was about creating a brand that reflects a world where people seek meaning and connection as much as they do quality. The audience watched intently, captivated by his words. James continued, his voice gaining strength. Luxury isn't just about what we wear or buy. It's about how it makes us feel, about how it empowers us. True luxury doesn't look down on people. It lifts them up. And that's the legacy we're building at Elise & Co. A legacy where everyone has the chance to feel seen, to feel valued, to feel elegant. As he spoke, James noticed nods of agreement and murmurs of approval rippling through the crowd. He could sense that his vision was resonating, sparking a shift in mindset among the attendees. And that's why we launched the Elise & Company Foundation, he continued, to ensure that future generations of designers, creators, and artisans from all backgrounds have the opportunity to contribute to this industry. We believe that the best ideas, the most beautiful creations, come from diverse perspectives. By supporting young talent and breaking down barriers, we're not only enriching our brand but the entire industry. When he finished, the audience rose to their feet in applause. James felt a deep, humbling gratitude as he took in the standing ovation, knowing that he had reached people on a level that went beyond business. He had shown them a future they hadn't imagined, a future that felt both bold and attainable. As he left the stage, several young designers and students approached him, eager to express how inspired they felt, how his words had validated their dreams. They thanked him, some sharing their own stories of struggle, and he saw in their eyes the spark of possibility, the belief that they too could belong in this world of elegance and creativity. That evening, as he walked through the city streets, James felt the weight of his journey settle into a peaceful satisfaction. Elise & Co. was no longer just a brand that he had transformed. It was a beacon, a symbol of what was possible when tradition and progress worked together. He had not only created a legacy, but had lit the way for others to build their own. And as he looked at the world around him, he felt certain that Elise & Company would continue to be a force of positive change, long after he was gone, standing as proof that true luxury lies not in exclusion but in empowerment and opportunity for all. As the years passed, Elise & Company continued to thrive, its reputation cemented not only as a brand of quality and elegance, but as a leader in the new era of luxury. The Elise & Company Foundation had grown substantially, supporting hundreds of young talents from around the world. Many of these individuals had gone on to make significant impacts in the fashion industry, each one carrying with them the spirit of inclusion, elegance, and opportunity that James had instilled. The foundation became a pipeline of creativity, a place where raw talent met nurturing guidance, where young designers and artisans could dream big and feel empowered to shape the future. James, now in his later years, took great satisfaction in watching the company evolve. Even as he gradually stepped back from day-to-day operations, he continued to mentor young leaders, passing on his values and insights, helping them understand that luxury could be both a statement of quality and a symbol of belonging. He knew that Elise & Company was in capable hands, people who shared his vision, who understood that the brand's strength lay in its willingness to embrace change while honoring its roots. One crisp autumn afternoon, James visited one of Elise & Company's flagship stores, now a bustling hub of diverse clientele and staff. As he walked through the elegantly designed space, he noticed how the brand had evolved, yet felt unmistakably like the Elise & Company he'd dreamed of. There were familiar elements, the timeless pieces, the high standard of service, but now there was an added warmth, a sense that everyone who walked through the doors belonged there. In one corner of the store, a young woman in her 20s approached him, a look of recognition dawning on her face. She introduced herself as one of the foundation's early scholarship recipients, now a designer working with the company. Her voice trembled slightly as she thanked him, expressing how his vision had changed her life, how the opportunity he'd provided had given her the confidence to pursue her dreams. James smiled warmly, feeling a deep sense of pride and fulfillment. "You belong here," he told her gently. "Remember that. You're part of something that was built to last, something that values people for who they are and what they bring to the world." As he left the store that day, he realized that Elise & Company had become more than he could have ever imagined. It was no longer simply a brand. It was a community, a legacy that was growing, evolving, and thriving on its own. His dream of transforming the meaning of luxury had not only come true, it had taken on a life of its own, living on in the people it touched. A few years later, after a life spent in quiet but determined service to his vision, James passed away peacefully, surrounded by family, friends, and colleagues who had been inspired by his journey. News of his passing spread quickly, touching the hearts of people around the world. Elise & Co.'s social media was flooded with tributes, from longtime customers and young designers alike, each sharing stories of how the brand had impacted them, how James's vision had inspired them to believe in something bigger. In honor of his legacy, the company hosted a celebration of James's life, attended by employees, clients, fashion icons, and young designers who had benefited from the foundation. The event took place in one of Elise & Co.'s most beautiful locations, a space filled with memories of James's journey and the countless lives he had touched. As people spoke, they shared memories and stories of how James had changed their lives, how his vision of luxury had reshaped an industry. They remembered his strength, his kindness, his unwavering belief in the power of inclusion. The celebration wasn't filled with sorrow, but with joy, a recognition of a life well lived, a dream realized, a legacy that would endure. Evelyn, now head of marketing and one of James's closest allies, gave a heartfelt speech, her voice filled with gratitude and admiration. James taught us that luxury isn't about exclusion. It's about creating something beautiful that people can connect to, something that makes them feel seen, valued, and empowered. He showed us that elegance lies not in shutting doors, but in opening them wide. Langston, now retired but present as a tribute to his old friend, spoke of James's unwavering dedication. James didn't just change Elise & Co. He changed all of us. He taught us that vision and heart could transform the world, one person at a time. His spirit lives on in every stitch, every design, every person who walks through these doors. As the night ended, guests lingered, sharing stories and smiles, a powerful reminder of the impact James had left on the world. The legacy he had built was no longer just a part of Elise & Company. It had become part of an entire industry, setting a new standard for what luxury could mean. And though he was gone, James's presence remained palpable in the walls of Elise & Company, in the lives he had touched and in the dreams he had inspired. He had shown the world that true luxury was not about keeping people out. It was about welcoming them in, embracing them, and letting them be part of something timeless, something beautiful, something that was now and forever truly inclusive. In the years that followed, Elise & Company continued to thrive, honoring James's vision, growing with each new generation, a beacon of elegance, resilience, and hope.